The merciless Arizona sun beat down on Sarah, Mitchell's weather-worn hat, as she guided her chestnut mare through the narrow canyon pass. 3 days of riding through the desert had left her clothes dust-covered and her canteen dangerously light. The year was 1885, and the Arizona Territory remained as wild and unforgiving as when she'd left it 5 years prior. "Just a little further, Belle," she whispered to her horse, patting its sweat-dampened neck. "We'll reach Copper Springs by nightfall." Sarah adjusted the pistol holstered at her hip, a necessary companion for a woman traveling alone in these parts. At 32, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd seen enough of life's hardships to no longer be frightened by shadows. The death of her husband 2 years ago had left her with little but determination and memories. She'd received word that her uncle had passed, leaving her his small ranch outside Copper Springs. It wasn't much, but it was a chance to start over. Away from the pitying glances of Philadelphia society that couldn't understand why a widow would choose independence over remarriage. The canyon walls rose higher on either side. As the path narrowed further, Sarah tensed slightly, aware that such passes were perfect for ambushes. Her father, a former cavalry officer, had taught her to read the land before she could even read books. The sound came suddenly, voices echoing off stone. Sarah pulled back on the reins, bringing Belle to a halt. Just ahead, the canyon opened into a small clearing, obscured by a bend in the rock face. The voices grew clearer, men arguing, their tones harsh and threatening. Instinct told her to turn back, but curiosity won out. She dismounted quietly, secured Belle to a scrub brush, and crept forward on foot. Staying close to the canyon wall dot as she peered around the bend, she witnessed a scene that froze her blood. 3 men surrounded a fourth who knelt in the dirt, hands bound behind his back. 1 man tall, with a black duster and a scar running from eye to jaw paste before the kneeling figure. "Last chance, Marshal," the scarred man said, his voice casual as if discussing the weather. "Tell us where the shipment's headed, and maybe you don't die today." The kneeling man, wearing a dusty but unmistakable Marshal's badge, spat blood onto the desert floor. "Go to hell, Reeves." A scarred man, Reeves sighed dramatically. "Wrong answer." He nodded to one of his companions, a stocky man with a red bandana. The shot echoed through the canyon like thunder. The Marshal's body crumpled forward. Sarah gasped involuntarily, then immediately pressed herself against the rock face, heart hammering. Had they heard her? What was that? One of the men's voices carried clearly. "Probably just a coyote." Another replied. "Check it out anyway," commanded Reeves. "We can't afford witnesses." Sarah's mind raced. She had seconds at most. Running back to Belle would make too much noise. Instead, she spotted a narrow crevice in the rock wall and squeezed into it, pressing herself as far back as possible. Footsteps approached, boots crunching on gravel. A shadow fell across the entrance to her hiding place. "Nothing here," called the man, barely 10 feet from where she hid. "Check the pass," Reeves ordered. "If someone saw us, they won't get far." Sarah held her breath, feeling exposed despite her concealment. The footsteps moved away, but she knew they'd find Belle soon enough. As if on cue, she heard a distant whinny. "Boss, there's a horse tied up back here." "Find the rider," Reeves barked. "No witnesses." Sarah drew her pistol, knowing her hiding place would soon be discovered. 3 against 1, not good odds, but she wouldn't die without a fight. Footsteps approached again, more purposeful this time. She saw the silhouette of a man peering into crevices along the wall, methodically working his way toward her. Come out," he called mockingly. "We know you're here." The man was less than 20 feet away now, his gun drawn. Sarah's finger tensed on the trigger. Suddenly, the distinctive sound of a rifle being cocked echoed through the canyon. A deep voice called out from somewhere above. "I'd reconsider your next move if I were you." The gunman spun, firing wildly toward the voice. A single rifle shot answered, and the man collapsed. "Ambush!" shouted one of the others. More gunfire erupted. From her position, Sarah couldn't see what was happening, but the sounds painted a clear picture of firefight. Brief but intense, then silence. "You can come out now, ma'am," called the same deep voice. "They won't be troubling anyone anymore." Sarah remained frozen, pistol still raised. This could be another trap. "I understand your caution," the voice continued. "Closer now. But if I meant you harm, I wouldn't be announcing myself." Slowly, Sarah emerged from the crevice, gun still ready. Standing before her was a tall man with broad shoulders, his face partially shadowed by a worn leather hat. A Winchester rifle rested casually in his hands, and a star-shaped scar marked his left cheekbone. "Jake Turner," he said simply, not offering his hand. His eyes steel gray, and assessing took her measure in an instant. "Sarah Mitchell," she replied, lowering her pistol slightly, but not holstering it. "You picked a bad place for sightseeing, Mrs. Mitchell." "Miss," she corrected automatically, "and I wasn't sightseeing. I was heading to Copper Springs when I heard voices." Jake nodded toward the clearing. "Well, you witnessed something you shouldn't have. Those men work for Victor Reeves. He runs guns and opium through these canyons." Sarah glanced toward the clearing. "The marshal dead," Jake confirmed grimly. "Avis was a good man. Been tracking Reeves's operation for months." "You knew him?" A shadow passed across Jake's face. "Once, in another life." He gestured to the bodies visible in the clearing. 2 dead. Reeves got away. "You're a lawman?" Sarah asked, noticing for the first time that his posture and the way he handled his weapon suggested formal training. "Not anymore." The finality in his tone discouraged further questions. Sarah holstered her pistol. "I need to get to Copper Springs. My uncle left me his ranch." Jake's expression changed slightly. "Samuel Mitchell was your uncle? You knew him too?" Everyone knew Old Sam. Jake glanced at the sky. "Sun's getting low. We need to move. Reeves will be back with more men once he realizes what happened." "We?" Sarah questioned. "You saw Reeves. You can identify him. That makes you a target." Jake started walking toward where Belle was tied. "I'll take you to Copper Springs, but then you should consider moving on. This territory just got dangerous for you." Sarah followed, bristling at his presumption. "I'm not running away. That ranch is all I have." Jake turned, his expression hard. "And you'd better learn to sleep with one eye open. Victor Reeves doesn't leave witnesses alive." As they retrieved Belle, Jake whistled, and a magnificent black stallion trotted into view from behind an outcropping of rocks. "This is Midnight," Jake said, mounting in one fluid motion. "He's faster than he looks. We'll need that advantage." Sarah mounted Belle, adjusting her saddlebags. "How far to Copper Springs?" "About 15 miles. If we ride hard, we can make it by nightfall." Jake's eyes scanned the horizon. "Reeves knows these canyons better than most. We'll take the high trail-less chance of an ambush." They rode in silence for the first few miles, climbing steadily out of the canyon onto a ridge that offered a commanding view of the surrounding desert. The sunset painted the landscape in fiery oranges and deep purples, a beauty that belied the danger they fled. "Why did you help me?" Sarah finally asked. "You could have ridden on." Jake kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "I've seen enough good people die in these territories. You said you were a lawman once." "Sheriff, over in Tucson." His jaw tightened. "That was a long time ago. What happened?" Jake remained silent for so long that Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. Reeves happened. His men raided a homestead outside town. By the time I got there, they'd killed every one man, woman, 2 children. His knuckles whitened on the reins. I tracked them for weeks. Caught up to 2 of them in a saloon in Nogales. And I didn't bring them in for trial. The admission hung in the air between them. The badge doesn't fit after something like that. Sarah understood the weight of his words. So you've been hunting Reeves since then? When I can find his trail, he's careful. Today was the closest I've come in months. The trail narrowed as they continued, forcing them to ride single file. Jake took the lead, his rifle now across his lap, ready. Sarah found herself studying him the way he constantly scanned their surroundings, a set of his shoulders that never fully relaxed. He was a man who'd lived too long expecting trouble. As the last light faded from the sky, they crested a rise that offered a view of a small valley below. Lights twinkled in the distance. Copper Springs, Jake announced. We'll be there in an hour. A shot rang out, the bullet kicking up dust just ahead of Midnight's hooves. The horse reared, but Jake controlled him expertly. Down, he shouted, drawing his rifle in one smooth motion and returning fire toward a cluster of rocks to their left. Sarah dismounted quickly, drawing her pistol and leading Belle behind a large boulder. Jake joined her seconds later, Midnight following obediently. How many? She whispered. At least 3, Jake replied, peering around the edge of the boulder. Another shot ricocheted off the rock. They must have circled ahead of us while staying out of sight. Reeves? Probably sent his men? He rarely does his own dirty work. Jake checked his ammunition. They have the high ground. We're pinned. Sarah assessed their situation. The boulder provided cover, but they were exposed on the right side. The path ahead descended steeply toward Copper Springs, offering little cover. Behind them, the trail was narrow and would make them easy targets. Ideas? She asked. Jake nodded toward a dry creek bed about 50 yards to their right. If we can make it there, we can follow it down toward town. It's our best chance. That's a lot of open ground to cover. I'll draw their fire. You make for the creek bed with the horses. Sarah shook her head. Too risky. We go together or not? At all. Jake's expression showed surprise, then something like respect. On my signal then? Ready? Sarah nodded, gathering Belle's reins. Now. Jake stood suddenly, firing rapidly toward the rocks where their attackers hid. Sarah dashed toward the creek bed, leading Belle. She heard Jake behind her, Midnight's hooves, pounding the hard-packed earth. Bullets kicked up dust around them, but the gunman's aim was thrown off by Jake's covering fire and their own movement. They reached the dry creek bed, sliding down its steep banks into relative safety. The natural trench was about 4 feet deep enough to conceal them if they stayed low. Head downstream, Jake directed. Keep the horses between you and the ridge. They moved as quickly as possible, leading the horses through the uneven terrain. The creek bed twisted and turned, gradually descending toward the valley floor. Gunshots continued sporadically, but their attackers seemed to have lost their exact position. After 20 minutes of difficult progress, the creek bed widened and became shallower. Ahead, it opened onto a flat expanse that would leave them exposed. Again, we can't follow it any further, Jake said, breathing heavily. We'll have to make a run for it from here. Town's about half a mile ahead. Sarah peered over the edge of the creek bank. In the moonlight, she could make out the scattered buildings of Copper Springs. So close, yet the open ground between seemed impossibly vast. They'll see us as soon as we leave cover, she observed. Jake nodded grimly. That's why we split up. I'll head east, draw their attention. You go straight for town. No, Sarah said firmly. I won't leave you to face them alone. This isn't a debate, Miss Mitchell. You need to— It's not a debate, she interrupted. I'm a better shot than you think, Mr. Turner. We stand a better chance together. Jake studied her for a long moment, then gave a curt nod. Stay close. If I say run, you run. Understood? Understood. They mounted their horses, staying low in the saddle. Jake checked his pistol one last time. Ready? Sarah nodded, her heart pounding, but her hands steady. Ride hard and don't look back, Jake said, then spurred Midnight forward out of the creek. Sarah followed, urging Belle to a full gallop. The night air rushed past as they thundered across the open ground toward Copper Springs. The first shots came from their right muzzle flashes in the darkness. Jake veered slightly in that direction, returning fire with his pistol. Sarah kept her course straight toward town, trusting Belle's speed and the darkness to protect her. She risked a glance back and saw 3 riders emerging from the shadows. Pursuing them, one rider was gaining on Jake. Sarah turned in her saddle, took careful aim, and fired. The pursuing rider fell from his horse. Jake looked back in surprise, then tipped his hat to her before focusing again on the path ahead. The remaining pursuers fell back, perhaps reconsidering the wisdom of chasing them into town where they might find help. As they reached the outskirts of Copper Springs, Sarah felt a surge of relief. They slowed their horses to a trot, not wanting to attract undue attention from the townspeople. The marshal's office is down the main street, Jake said, scanning the buildings. We should report what happened. Will they believe us? Jake's expression darkened. Depends on who's wearing the badge these days. Small towns like this. Reeves could have people on his payroll. They tied their horses outside a building marked Sheriff's Office and entered cautiously. The office was empty, except for a young deputy dozing in a chair, boots propped on a desk. The deputy startled awake at their entrance, nearly falling from his chair. "Can I help you folks?" he asked, straightening his vest self-consciously. "We need to speak with the sheriff," Jake said. "It's urgent." "Sheriff's not here. Rode out to the Anderson place this morning. Won't be back till tomorrow." The deputy eyed them suspiciously, noting their dusty, trail-worn appearance. "I'm Deputy Clark. What's this about?" Jake exchanged a glance with Sarah. "We were ambushed on the high trail. Marshal Davis has been murdered by Victor Reeves and his men." The deputy's face paled. "Marshal Davis? Are you certain?" "We saw it happen," Sarah confirmed. Deputy Clark ran a hand through his hair, clearly overwhelmed. I need to send a telegram to the territorial office." He looked at Jake more carefully. "Do I know you, mister?" "No," Jake replied flatly. "Is there a doctor in town?" "Miss Mitchell needs to see to some cuts and bruises." The deputy pointed down the street. "Doc Wilson's place is 3 doors down. But I'll need statements from both of you before you leave town." "You'll get them," Jake assured him. "First thing tomorrow." Outside, Sarah raised an eyebrow at Jake. "I don't have any cuts or bruises." "No, but you do need rest, and I wanted to get you away from there. That deputy's too green to be helpful, and we don't know who might be listening." Jake untied Midnight's reins. "Where's your uncle's ranch?" "About 2 miles north of town, according to his letter." Jake nodded. "We'll get a room at the hotel tonight. It's safer than riding out to an empty ranch in the dark, especially with Reeves's men in the area." The Copper Springs Hotel was a modest 2-story building with a small saloon on the ground floor. A few patrons looked up as they entered, but quickly returned to their drinks. The clerk raised his eyebrows at the sight of a woman in trail clothes, but asked no questions as Jake requested 2 rooms. "Only got one available," the clerk replied. "Cattle buyers in town." Jake looked at Sarah questioningly. "I'll take the room," she decided. "You can find somewhere else." "Not a chance," Jake countered. "I'll take a chair by the door." Reeves might have men in town already. Sarah wanted to argue, but knew he was right. Fine, but I'm paying for my half. After settling the bill, they made their way upstairs to a small but clean room with a single bed, washstand, and chair. I'll bring up some food from the saloon. Jake offered. You should rest. When he'd gone, Sarah finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of the day's events. She'd witnessed a murder, been hunted through the desert, and now found herself dependent on a stranger with his own dangerous past. She removed her hat and gun belt, then poured water from the pitcher into the basin to wash her face and hands. The cool water revived her somewhat, but exhaustion tugged at her limbs. Jake returned with a tray bearing 2 plates of stew, bread, and coffee. It's not fancy, but it's hot. They ate in companionable silence, the events of the day creating an unusual bond between them. When they'd finished, Jake took the tray and placed it outside the door. You should get some sleep, he said, settling into the chair and placing his pistol on his lap. Tomorrow we'll need to decide what to do about Reeves. What do you mean? What to do? We tell the sheriff everything and let the law handle it. Jake's laugh was without humor. The law hasn't been able to touch Reeves for years. He has money in all the right pockets. So what then? We just let him get away with murder? No, Jake said, his voice hardening. But this isn't your fight. Tomorrow, I'll take you to your uncle's ranch, and then I'll deal with Reeves. I witnessed the murder too, Sarah reminded him. That makes it my fight. Jake studied her with those penetrating gray eyes. Why did you come out here, really? Most women wouldn't choose to start over alone in a place like this. Sarah looked out the window at the unfamiliar town, silvered by moonlight. After my husband died, everyone expected me to remarry quickly or move in with relatives. Live the life they thought appropriate for a widow. She turned back to Jake. But I've never been good at meeting others' expectations. This ranch represents freedom, a chance to build something that's mine alone, even if it means putting yourself in danger. Especially then, she replied with a small smile. Living safely behind walls isn't really living at all. Something shifted in Jake's expression, recognition, perhaps, of a kindred spirit. Get some rest, Miss Mitchell. Tomorrow will come soon enough. Sarah lay down on the bed fully clothed, too tired to worry about propriety. As she drifted toward sleep, she heard Jake check his pistol and move the chair to block the door. In those last moments before consciousness faded, Sarah realized that for the first time since her husband's death, she didn't feel completely alone. The first light of dawn filtered through the thin curtains when Sarah awoke. For a moment, she was disoriented, the unfamiliar room and the events of the previous day jumbling in her mind. Then she saw Jake Turner by the window, his tall frame silhouetted against the growing light, and everything rushed back. He turned. At her movement, "Morning. Thought I'd let you sleep." Sarah sat up, running a hand through her tangled hair. "Have you been awake all night?" Old habits. Jake offered a cup of coffee from a pot that must have been brought up while she slept. "I checked on your horse. She's rested and fed. Thank you." Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, its warmth and bitter strength helping to clear her mind. "What's your plan?" Jake returned to the window, peering down at the street below. "The sheriff should be back today. We'll talk to him, though I don't expect much help. And then? Then I take you to your uncle's ranch and make sure it's secure." Sarah studied him over the rim of her cup. "And after that, you'll go after Reeves alone?" Jake's silence was answer enough. "That's suicide," she said flatly. "Maybe." He turned from the window, his expression unreadable. "But Reeves has to be stopped, and I'm not seeing a line of volunteers." Sarah set down her cup and stood. "I need to visit the general store for supplies before we head to the ranch." I'll come with you. I'm perfectly capable. It's not about capability, Jake interrupted. Reeves has men everywhere. Until we know who in this town is on his payroll, we stick together. Sarah wanted to argue, but knew he was right. Fine, give me 10 minutes. To make myself presentable. When they descended to the hotel lobby, the clerk handed Jake a folded note. Boy brought this for you earlier, mister. Jake read it quickly, his brow furrowing. Sheriff's back. Deputy Clark told him about Marshal Davis. He wants to see us right away. The sheriff's office was more active than the previous evening. 2. Men in conversation fell silent as Jake and Sarah entered. One wore a sheriff's badge, a heavy-set man with a thick mustache and suspicious eyes. You the ones who reported seeing Marshal Davis killed? The sheriff asked without preamble. Yes, Jake answered. I'm Jake Turner. This is Miss Sarah Mitchell. Recognition flickered in the sheriff's eyes at Jake's name, but he didn't comment on it. I'm Sheriff Pearson. This here's Hank Willis from the Territorial Marshal's office. The other man lean, with hard eyes and a marshal's badge, nodded curtly. We found Marshal Davis's body this morning, Willis said. Shot in the head, just like you described. And the men who killed him? Sarah asked. Gone, Sheriff Pearson replied. Though we found one dead about half a mile outside town. Your work? He directed this question at Jake. Miss Mitchell's, actually, Jake replied, causing both lawmen to reassess Sarah with surprise. You're certain it was Victor Reeves who ordered the killing? Willis asked. Absolutely, Sarah confirmed. I heard them call him by name, and the marshal knew him too. Willis and Pearson exchanged glances. Problem is, Pearson said slowly, Reeves was in Tucson yesterday, meeting with the territorial governor about his mining interests. Half a dozen. Witnesses can place him there. That's impossible, Sarah protested. I saw him. I heard his voice. Could have been someone claiming to be Reeves, Willis suggested. He has a lot of enemies who might try to frame him. Jake's voice was dangerously quiet. Are you calling Miss Mitchell a liar? Willis raised his hands placatingly. Not at all. Just saying memories get confused in stressful situations. Maybe you heard the name wrong. I know what I saw, Sarah insisted. And what I heard. Sheriff Pearson sighed heavily. Look, we'll investigate Marshal Davis's murder fully, but without solid evidence linking Reeves to the crime. The word of 2 witnesses isn't evidence enough? Jake challenged. Not against a man with Reeves's connections, Willis replied bluntly. The governor himself considers Reeves a friend. Jake's hand moved imperceptibly closer to his pistol. So that's how it is. Sheriff Pearson noticed the movement. Don't make this worse, Turner. Your reputation precedes you. What reputation is that? Sarah asked, looking between them. Mr. Turner here was asked to surrender his badge after gunning down 2 unarmed men in Nogales, Willis explained. Claimed they were working for Reeves, but couldn't prove it. They weren't unarmed, Jake said coldly, and they confessed before I killed them. An uncomfortable silence filled the office. We'll need your formal statements, Pearson finally said. Then you're free to go about your business. But I'd advise staying in town for a few days in case we have more questions. After providing their statements detailed accounts that Sarah suspected would be conveniently misplaced, they left the sheriff's office. They're not going to do anything, are they? Sarah asked as they walked toward the general store. No, Jake confirmed grimly. Willis is probably on Reeves's payroll. Pearson might be honest, but he's not going to cross the territorial office, so Marshal Davis's murder goes unpunished. For now. Jake's tone suggested this was a temporary condition. The general store was busy with morning customers. Sarah purchased the essentials she'd need for the ranch food staples, ammunition, basic tools. Jake added extra ammunition for his own weapons to her order. I'm paying for my own supplies, he said when she raised an eyebrow dot as the shopkeeper gathered their items. Sarah noticed a man watching them from across the store. He pretended to examine a display of knives when she looked his way, but his interest was obvious. She nudged Jake subtly. We're being watched. Jake didn't turn but nodded slightly. I've noticed. There are 2 more outside. Reeves's men? Most likely. Jake paid for his ammunition. We need to get to your ranch. It's too exposed here. They collected their supplies and loaded them onto their horses. The men Sarah had noticed made no move to approach them, but their eyes followed every movement dot as they rode north out of town. Sarah kept glancing back. No one following us yet. They will, Jake said confidently. But they'll want to catch us somewhere isolated, away from witnesses. The road to the ranch wound through scrubland, dotted with mesquite and prickly pear cactus. The spring heat was building, creating shimmering mirages on the horizon. Tell me about your uncle, Jake said after they'd ridden in silence for some time. Samuel Mitchell was my father's brother, Sarah replied. They had a falling out before I was born. Something about a woman they both loved. She smiled faintly. My father won, obviously. So you never met your uncle? Once when I was very young. He came east for my grandmother's funeral. I remember a tall man with kind eyes who brought me a silver bracelet. Sarah touched her wrist reflexively, though the bracelet was long gone. We corresponded occasionally over the years. When my husband died, he invited me to visit. Before I could arrange the journey, I received news of his death and the bequest of his ranch. Jake nodded thoughtfully. Samuel Mitchell was well respected around these parts. Kept to himself mostly, but always helped neighbors in need. Some said he was sitting on a silver mine, but never worked it. A silver mine? This was news to Sarah. His letter mentioned cattle, not mining, just a local rumor. Probably nothing to it. They crested a small rise, and below them lay a modest ranch, a single-story house with a barn, corral, and a few outbuildings. A windmill turned lazily in the breeze, pumping water into a stock tank. Home sweet home, Sarah murmured, feeling a mix of emotions at seeing her inheritance for the first time. Jake surveyed the property with a professional eye. Good defensible position. Clear sight lines in all directions. Your uncle chose well. They approached cautiously, but the ranch appeared deserted. The front door was secured with a padlock, which Sarah opened with the key that had accompanied her uncle's will. The interior was simple but comfortable. A main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, 2 bedrooms, and a storage room. Everything was neat and covered with a fine layer of dust. Hasn't been disturbed since your uncle died, Jake observed, checking each room methodically. That's good. Sarah ran her finger along a bookshelf filled with volumes on mining, geology, and Western history. Her uncle had been a reader. It seemed something they had in common. Jake returned from inspecting the back of the house. Everything looks secure. I'll check the barn and outbuildings. While he was gone, Sarah opened windows to air out the stale rooms and unpack the supplies they'd brought. Despite the circumstances, she felt a growing sense of connection to this place, her place now. Jake returned as she was filling a kettle for tea. Barn's in good condition. There's about 20 head of cattle in the south pasture, being tended by a ranch hand named Miguel. He lives in a small cabin by the creek. Says your uncle owed him 2 months' wages. I'll pay him, of course, Sarah said. Is that all the stock? From what Miguel says, your uncle sold most of his herd last fall. Seemed to be focusing more on something else. The mine? Jake shrugged. Miguel didn't know details. Just said your uncle spent a lot of time in the hills to the north. Sarah put the kettle on the stove and lit the fire beneath it. I should explore up there. Not today, Jake cautioned. We need to secure the ranch first. Reeves's men could show up any time. As if summoned by his words, they heard the distant sound of approaching horses. Jake moved to the window, careful to stay out of sight. 3 riders coming fast. Get your gun. Sarah retrieved her pistol from her saddlebag and joined Jake at the window. The riders were still too far away to identify. Could be innocent travelers, she suggested without much conviction. Could be. Jake agreed, equally dubious. But we won't take chances. Is there a cellar or storm shelter? I haven't looked. Jake searched quickly, finding a trapdoor in the kitchen floor hidden under a rug. Down here, if shooting starts, this is your fallback position. I'm not hiding while you fight, Sarah protested. Not asking you to hide, just giving you a defensible position. Jake checked his pistol. I'll take the front. You cover the back door. If they're friendly, no harm done. If not, the approaching. Riders slowed as they neared the house, spreading out to approach from different angles. Not the behavior of friendly visitors. Reeves's men, Jake confirmed grimly. They waited until we were away from town. What do they want? We've already given our statements. Reeves doesn't leave loose ends. Jake positioned himself beside the front window, out of sight, but able to see the approaching riders. He'll want us silenced before we can talk to anyone else. Sarah took position at the back window, her heart pounding but her hands steady. The peaceful ranch she'd inherited had suddenly become a battleground. One rider approached the front porch, while the others circled toward the back and side of the house. Hello, the house, called the man at the front. Just want to talk. Jake and Sarah exchanged glances, both recognizing the transparent ploy. State your business. Jake called back without showing himself. Name's Carter. Work for Mr. Reeves. He's concerned about some misunderstandings and wants to clear things up. Misunderstandings like Marshall Davis's murder? Jake replied. Carter's. Friendly tone hardened. That's exactly the kind of loose talk Mr. Reeves is concerned about. He's offering $500 for you both to leave the territory. Today. And if we decline, then things get complicated. Carter's voice left no doubt about what complicated meant. Jake turned to Sarah, speaking quietly. This is your ranch, your decision. Sarah's jaw set determinedly. I'm not being run off my own property, and I'm not being bribed to forget a murder. Jake nodded, a hint of approval in his eyes. Carter, he called out. Tell Reeves we're not interested in his money or his threats. Now get off this property. Don't be stupid, Turner. Carter shouted back. You're outnumbered. Not for long, Jake muttered, then raised his voice again. Last warning, Carter. Ride away now. Instead of a verbal response, a shot shattered the front window, sending glass shards across the floor. Jake dropped to one knee, returning fire through the broken window. Outside, Carter cursed and took cover behind a water trough. At the back of the house, Sarah saw a man trying to approach the rear door. She aimed carefully and fired. The man yelped in pain and fell back. Got one, she called to Jake. Good shooting, he replied, firing again at Carter. Keep watching that back door. The third man had disappeared from view. Sarah scanned the area behind the house, but saw no movement. Suddenly, the distinctive crack of breaking wood came from the bedroom. Jake heard it too. He's coming in through the side window. Jake moved toward the bedroom door. Sarah stayed at her position, divided between watching the back door and the new threat. A series of shots from the bedroom confirmed Jake had engaged. The third attacker, Carter, used the distraction to make a run for the front door. Sarah shifted her aim and fired twice. Carter stumbled but made it to the porch. The front door burst open, and Carter staggered in, bleeding from his shoulder, but with his gun raised. Sarah fired again, her bullet finding its mark. Carter collapsed on the threshold, his pistol clattering. To the floor, Jake emerged from the bedroom, a fresh cut on his cheek, but otherwise unharmed. "The third one's down," he reported. "You got Carter?" Sarah nodded, suddenly aware of the trembling in her hands, now that the immediate danger had passed. Jake checked Carter's body, then looked outside. "The one you wounded at the back is gone. Probably rode for reinforcements. What do we do?" "We can't stay here." Jake began gathering essentials. "Reeves will send more men, better prepared next time." "I'm not abandoning my ranch," Sarah insisted. "Not abandoning. Strategic retreat." Jake handed her a saddlebag. "Pack what you need. We'll head into the hills where your uncle was prospecting. Reeves's men won't know the terrain." Sarah wanted to argue, but recognized the wisdom in his plan. They quickly packed food, ammunition, water, and basic supplies. "What about Miguel?" Sarah asked as they prepared to leave. "We'll warn him on our way out. He can decide whether to stay or go." They mounted their horses and rode to Miguel's cabin. By the creek, the young ranch hand listened gravely to their warning. "I will stay with the cattle," he decided. "These men, they will not bother a simple vaquero." "Be careful," Sarah cautioned him. "If they come asking questions—" "I know nothing," Miguel assured her with a knowing smile. "But I will watch. If they leave, I will put a white cloth on the fence post as signal." Jake nodded approvingly. "Smart man. We'll check from the ridge when we can." They rode north, following a narrow trail into the hills that rose behind the ranch. The terrain became increasingly rugged, with pine trees replacing the desert scrub. As they gained elevation, by late afternoon, they had climbed high enough to look back and see the ranch below, a tiny oasis in the vast landscape. No riders were visible approaching or leaving. "We should make camp before dark," Jake suggested, pointing to a sheltered hollow near a small spring. Defensible position with water. They dismounted and cared for the horses before setting up a simple camp. Jake built a small, nearly smokeless fire while Sarah arranged their supplies. "Do you think your uncle really found silver up here?" Jake asked as they ate a simple meal of jerky, and Hardtack. Sarah shrugged. "I don't know. His letters never mentioned mining, but there must have been some reason he spent time in these hills. First light tomorrow, we'll look for signs of his prospecting." Jake added a small branch to the fire. "For tonight, we should take watches, 4 hours each." "I'll take first watch," Sarah volunteered. Jake looked like he might object, but then nodded. "Wake me if you hear anything unusual." "Anything at all." He settled on his bedroll, hat pulled low over his eyes, and was asleep within minutes. The skill of a man accustomed to catching rest when possible. Sarah sat by the small fire, her pistol across her lap, listening to the night sounds of the wilderness. The stars emerged, countless and brilliant in the clear mountain air. Despite the danger that had driven them here, she felt a strange peace. The land that stretched below her was harsh but beautiful, demanding respect rather than submission. Perhaps that was why her uncle had chosen to make his life here. Far from the confining politeness of Eastern society, her watch passed uneventfully, and she gently woke Jake for his turn. As they traded places, their hands touched briefly, sending an unexpected warmth through her despite the cool night air. "Sleep well, Miss Mitchell," Jake said softly. "Sarah," she corrected him. "I think we're beyond formalities now." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Sarah, then, sleep well." She did sleep, deeply and dreamlessly, until Jake's hand on her shoulder brought her instantly awake. "Dawn's coming," he said. "No trouble in the night." They ate a cold breakfast and broke camp efficiently. Jake studied the surrounding hills. "If your uncle was mining, he'd need water for sluicing," he reasoned. "Let's follow this spring uphill." The spring led them to a larger stream that tumbled down the mountainside. As they followed it upward, Jake occasionally dismounted to examine. The terrain or rock formations dot around midday. He stopped suddenly, kneeling to examine something on the ground. "Boot prints," he announced. "Recent, but not fresh. Maybe a week old." Sarah joined him, seeing the faint impressions in the soft earth. "My uncle died 3 weeks ago. Could someone else be up here?" "Possible. The prints lead that way." Jake pointed toward a rocky outcropping. They proceeded cautiously, leading their horses through the increasingly difficult terrain. As they rounded the outcropping, Jake held up his hand for a halt. Ahead, partially hidden by trees and natural rock formations, was the entrance to a mine. "Looks like we found what your uncle was working on," Jake observed. They approached carefully, alert for any signs of recent activity. The mine entrance was secured with a heavy wooden door, padlocked shut. "Do you have a key for this too?" Jake asked. Sarah shook her head. "Just the house key came with the will." Jake examined the lock. Recent model. Good quality. He looked around, then picked up a rock and smashed the lock with several precise blows. The door creaked open, revealing a tunnel that extended into the mountain. Jake lit a lantern they'd brought and led the way inside. The tunnel was surprisingly well constructed, with timber supports and a small rail line for ore carts. They followed it about 50 yards before it opened into a larger chamber. Jake raised the lantern, illuminating the space. Against the far wall was a small table with maps and papers. Mining tools hung on racks, and several crates of supplies were neatly stacked, but what caught their attention was the exposed vein of ore running through the rock wall metal that gleamed dully in the lantern light. "Silver," Jake confirmed, examining it closely. "Rich vein, too." Sarah picked up one of the papers on the table. It was a letter, addressed to her, but never sent. She read it silently, her expression growing troubled. "What is it?" Jake asked. "A letter from my uncle," she replied. "Dated 2 days before he died." She read aloud. "My dear niece, I must warn you about the dangers you may face when you arrive. I've discovered something that changes everything. The silver is only part of it. Reeves has learned of my discovery and has made threats. If anything happens to me, trust no one in Copper Springs except Miguel. The proof is in the strong box under the floorboards in my bedroom. Be careful. Your loving Uncle Samuel." Jake's expression hardened. "Reeves killed your uncle for this mine." "But why?" Sarah questioned. "My uncle says the silver is only part of it. What else could there be?" "Let's find out." Jake began searching the chamber methodically. In a small alcove cut into the rock, they found a metal box similar to the one mentioned in the letter. It was locked, but the key hung on a nail nearby, hidden in plain sight. Inside were documents, deeds, maps, and letters. Sarah examined them quickly, her eyes widening. "These are land purchase records," she explained. "My uncle was buying up property all through this valley. Small parcels from different owners, but together they form a complete route from Copper Springs to the territorial border." Jake looked over her shoulder at the maps. "A smuggling route, the most direct path from Mexico to the northern territories." Reeves's smuggling route, Sarah realized. My uncle discovered it and started buying the land to block him. And found silver in the process. Jake examined the other papers. "These letters are correspondence with the territorial governor. Your uncle was building a case against Reeves. That's why Reeves killed him," Sarah said, anger replacing shock. "And why he wants us silenced. If these documents reached the right authorities, even Reeves's connections couldn't protect him," Jake finished. "This is evidence of smuggling, land fraud, and likely murder." Sarah carefully returned the documents to the box. "We need to get these to someone who can't be bought. Someone outside Reeves's influence. The federal marshal in Tucson might help. Jake suggested, he and I have history, but he's honest. A noise from the tunnel entrance froze them both. Jake immediately extinguished the lantern, plunging them into darkness. Someone's coming, he whispered. Take the box and hide behind those crates. Sarah complied, clutching the metal box to her chest as she took cover. Jake positioned himself near the entrance to the chamber, gun drawn. Footsteps approached, accompanied by the glow of a lantern. A voice called out, "Mitchell, you in here?" Jake remained silent, waiting. The lantern light grew brighter as a figure entered the chamber. In the dim illumination, Sarah recognized Victor Reeves himself, accompanied by 2 armed men. "Search the place," Reeves ordered. "Find those documents." As the men spread out, Jake made his move. "That's far enough, Reeves." The men spun toward his voice, weapons raised. Jake fired first, hitting one of the gunmen. The second fired back. The muzzle flash briefly illuminating the dark chamber. Sarah used the distraction to move behind a different set of crates, still clutching the box of evidence. Jake and the second gunman exchanged fire, their shots deafeningly loud in the confined space. A bullet splintered the crate near Sarah's head. Through the chaos, she realized Reeves was moving toward the exit. He would escape while his men provided cover. Without hesitation, Sarah drew her pistol and stepped from behind the crates. "Stop right there, Reeves." Reeves turned, surprise evident even in the dim light. He raised his own weapon. 2 shots rang out simultaneously. Sarah felt a burning across her upper arm as Reeves staggered backward, clutching his chest. "You ... He gasped, recognition in his voice, before he collapsed. The remaining gunman, seeing his employer fall, threw down his weapon. "Don't shoot. I surrender." Jake approached cautiously, keeping his gun trained on the man. "Light the lantern," he ordered. When light filled the chamber again, the scene became clear. 1 gunman dead, Reeves motionless on the ground, and the 3rd man standing with his hands raised. Sarah pressed a handkerchief to her wounded arm. The box of documents still secure under her other arm. Jake checked Reeves for signs of life and found none. "Good shot," he told Sarah, genuine admiration in his voice. "Not my first choice," she replied grimly, but he left no alternative. They bound the surviving gunman and gathered the evidence. The ride back to the ranch was tense but uneventful. As they approached, they saw the white cloth Miguel had promised fluttering from the fence post the all-clear signal. Miguel greeted them with evident relief. "Señora, I feared for you. Men came looking, but they left when they could not find you." "Thank you for your loyalty, Miguel," Sarah said warmly. "You'll be well compensated." "The sheriff should be informed," Jake suggested. "With Reeves dead and the evidence we have, his protection in town will crumble quickly." Sarah nodded in agreement. "And then?" Jake looked at her, something unspoken passing between them. "And then you have a ranch to run, and possibly a silver mine to develop." "Alone?" Sarah asked, the question carrying more weight than the single word suggested. Jake's usually stoic expression softened. "That depends. On what?" "On whether you might consider taking on a partner, someone who knows the territory. Someone who might be looking for a fresh start." Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile since the ordeal began. "I might be amenable to such an arrangement, under the right conditions." "And those would be?" "That my partner understands I make my own decisions, that we're equals in this venture." Jake nodded slowly. "I believe those terms are acceptable, Miss Mitchell." "Sarah," she corrected him again. "Sarah," he agreed, the name sounding different somehow when spoken with a new understanding between them. As they rode toward town with their prisoner and evidence, the setting sun painted the landscape in gold and crimson. The path ahead would not be easy. There would be investigations, possibly trials, and certainly challenges in developing both the ranch and mine. But for the first time in years, neither Sarah nor Jake would face those challenges alone. In this harsh but beautiful land, they had found not only justice, but perhaps something even more valuable, a chance at redemption, and the promise of a future neither had dared to imagine.